everyone, welcome back. In the last few videos, we've been focusing on key thinkers from the Middle Ages to see sort of some of the shifts that were taking place, especially getting us ready to talk about Protestantism. Well, I decided to end this series with a figure named Catherine of Siena, and I should start by explaining why I picked her as the sort of final note in this piece. One, it's about time we heard from a woman. Catherine of Siena recently has been named a doctor of the church in Roman Catholicism to represent just how important she is. And I'm having us read her because she's important in her own time. But also, it is nice to hear a woman's voice in all of this because this has been a conversation dominated by male voices. But beyond that, I think that there's something about Catherine of Siena that offers us a unique counterbalance to some of the things we've been seeing. Catherine of Siena is not a scholastic. She's a mystic. And we've talked about a certain form of mysticism, like apophatic theology, but she embodies a form that's bound up with the life of prayer and contemplation, that is intentionally set aside from sort of everyday forms of Christianity and especially scholastic forms of Christianity. So I'm sort of showing my hand here and showing my own my own interests, because if someone were to say to you, well, Catherine's not doing real theology, she's just talking about prayer, or she's doing pastoral theology or mystical theology, well, I would just push back to say that's too limited of a definition of theology. Theology is not just defined as systematic theology or scholastic theology. Thomas Aquinas is doing a great service in his theology, but that's not the only way to do it. Catherine of Siena is also doing a great service in her theology. So I would say in modern times, you would want to pick up a good dogmatics like Karl Barth and get a very sort of systematic approach. But you could also pick up C.S. Lewis. You could think about Christ and the Incarnation in terms of two natures and what all that means. You could also talk about Aslan and Aslan's return and what all that means. So I think Catherine of Siena gives us a nice counterbalance that shows us theology can be embodied in many different voices. And theology is as much about capturing the imagination and the heart as it is about the mind and the reason. So with reading Catherine, you can't just read her really fast and go point by point by point like you would for a normal school assignment. At least that's not the way you should read her. You should read her slowly, because she has all these different images and extended metaphors, and you have to let them wash over you one at a time, like waves coming in with the tide. And she talks about some metaphors that don't quite fit with other metaphors. What are the different doors that we have to close and when we go into the house of self-knowledge? Well, you're never going to be able to systematize that with the imagery you see from her talk about the bridge of Christ crucified and the 3 steps along that bridge. Those don't really systematically fit together. And yet, if you'll sit with these images, let them wash over you, feel these images, well, I think there's much to be gained and much that can help our imagination, our heart, as well as our reason and our thinking about God and our Christian walk. Now, Catherine's one of those figures that I think is really important that we understand her context, where she's coming from, the time in which she's writing. It just gives you a real keen insight into how important her work is and how important the things she says are. Now, to do this, I'm running through a very controversial time in medieval history when the Catholic Church, which remember has already splintered off from the Eastern Orthodox churches, the Greek churches. There's been a dispute over the Filioque clause and over the role of the papacy, and they don't think the papacy has authority over a church council. And so this split has now made Western Christianity its own thing. But now we're coming into what's also sometimes called the Great Schism, or the Great Schism within Western Christianity, or sometimes called the Papal Schism, where there was a split that took place. And I just need to give a caveat up front that there's a whole lot of additional details and history and nuances that I should give to this, but I just can't squeeze all of that in. And I'm going to try to go really, really fast, which means I'm going to do a poor job of representing all parties involved. The last thing I want to do is mock this, But I do need to point out that people at the time were mocking this. So this is a great embarrassment for the church. It's a great embarrassment for all who study this history looking back. No one's proud of this. We're not here to mock this. We're going to try to learn from it, but we have to be honest about what was going on. So now, more than I've done in the past, I'm going to go through a whole lot of dates and names, and you can always pause this video and come back if you need to look at some of those. But I hope if I go through this quickly, we can really catch what was going on. So buckle your seatbelts. Here we go. We're going to start in the year 1309 when Pope Clement V was elected. He'd been elected a few years earlier, and then in 1309, he decided to do something pretty drastic. At the request of the King of France, he moved his papal residency from Rome, he's the Bishop of Rome, to a palace in Avignon, France. And the argument was basically, this is the center of the action now. Western Christianity has shifted to Western Europe, and so let's put you in the center of it all. And that was great if you're French, but to, say, Italians, it looked like the Pope was now in the back pocket of the King of France. And so sometimes people call this the Babylonian captivity of the papacy, because it didn't just last for Clement's rule. He remained in Avignon, absent from Rome, even after his time period, and popes after him stayed in Avignon, France. No, there was an absentee bishop as far as Rome was concerned. Finally, in 1378, at the insistence or at the advice of Catherine of Siena, Pope Gregory XI moved the papal residency back to Rome. And this just shows you how influential Catherine is. But there's more to the story. That seemed like finally everyone, at least in Italy, got what they wanted. However, before the year was out, poor Pope Greg had passed away. So rest in peace, Pope Gregory. Now we have to elect a new pope. And important to get the date here, on April 18th, Pope Urban VI was appointed. It seemed to be that the cardinals thought he was an elderly pope and would sort of be there for a few years while they sorted out what they really wanted to have happen, and he would just do what they told him to do. However, he did not. He did his own thing. And so it wasn't long before they deposed Pope Urban VI, all sorts of terrible accusations made against him, and they then appointed Pope Clement VII in September 20th. Here's the problem. Pope Urban VI said, wait a minute, who died and made you pope? I'm still the rightful heir to Peter. I'm still sitting in the papal palace on St. Peter's throne. I'm still the pope. And now you have not just one pope, but two popes. And where is Pope Clement VII supposed to reign if he can't take over the seat of power that Pope Urban VI still has? And someone pointed out that there actually is another papal throne and another papal palace in Avignon, France. And so Pope Clement moved his papacy there. So now we have not just one pope, but two popes. The Bishop of Rome in Rome and the Bishop of Rome in Avignon, France. And which is right? All parties lined up on different sides, and now there is schism in the church. And what's worse, this goes on for some time. Both popes died. Both popes were succeeded by other popes, and there were two lines of the papacy, one in Rome, one in France. By the year 1409, finally there were enough cardinals that were able to unite together to say this can't go on. We're going to have to put a stop to this. And so they met in the town of Pisa in Rome and held a council. And the idea was, since neither pope was willing to reconcile with the other, and neither was willing to come to this council and make amends, both popes were deposed, the Bishop of Rome in Rome and the Bishop of Rome in France. However, neither of these popes in Pisa agreed to be deposed. The Bishop of Rome in Rome said, hey, who died and made you pope? The Bishop of Rome in France said, who died and made you pope? They both reigned from their papal throne. And even though the Council of Pisa had appointed a new pope, Pope Alexander V, these other two popes refused to acknowledge him. And so now, where is Alexander V supposed to reside, and where is he supposed to reign? Well, he really can't go anywhere. He's stuck in this town of Pisa. And so now we have not just one pope, not just two popes, but three popes. The Bishop of Rome in Rome, the Bishop of Rome in Avignon, and the Bishop of Rome in Pisa. Now again, this is where it is a laughingstock. Everyone is mocking this. I mean, 100 years later, you still have Erasmus making fun of this under a pseudonym. So everyone knows this is an embarrassment. What is there to do? Well, this is eventually going to be resolved at the Council of Constance or Constance, 1414. Now, this council is going to go on for several years, but the way it gets started is they summon Pope John the 23rd, who was the successor to Alexander V in Pisa, the Bishop of Rome in Pisa, the third pope. And they come to realize that the mistake at the Council of Pisa was they had a church council without papal authority. Clearly, we got to have papal authority, and so the Pope, the Bishop of Rome from Pisa, comes, and John the 23rd gives his seal of approval to this council. Then things go wrong. They immediately depose Pope John the 23rd, and all sorts of charges are laid against him, but later they work it out, and he retires happily ever after to some villa in the countryside. Yet the other two popes have been denounced, and so they can go on about their business and get things done. Eventually, though, remember these other two popes don't agree to be denounced, and so eventually the Bishop of Rome in Rome, that is Gregory the 12th, agrees to come, and he's going to work out the relationship with the council so that he will actually give his papal seal of approval to this council. So you have not just one papal approval, the Bishop of Rome in Pisa, but two. The Bishop of Rome in Rome also approves of this council. But then they depose him immediately, and he is charged up with all sorts of things. Eventually they work it out and negotiate, and he retires happily ever after to a villa in the countryside. The Bishop of Rome in Avignon is also still denounced, and now there is no papal authority in this time. And the Bishop of Rome's line eventually just dies out. Fewer and fewer cardinals are supporting him. It gets down to only one cardinal, etc. The end for the Bishop of Rome's line in Avignon, France. The Council of Constance continues to go about its business until finally in 1415 they appoint Pope Martin, and Pope Martin gives his papal seal of approval. So now you've had 3 different popes approve of this council, and Pope Martin's line is the one that succeeds all the way to this day today. Now we finally have things resolved. Now there's not 3 popes, not 2 popes, there's only one pope, and that's the succession that survives. But the council had other business to attend to. And I've got to cover this very, very quickly, but it's important to see this as a setup for what's coming later. At the council, there were people who were summoned to give an account for some of the things they were saying in criticism of all of this. Jan Hus was a Moravian who was brought in, and we call him a proto-reformer because he was saying things like, well, maybe we don't even need a pope. And why is it the pope gets to make some of these decisions? And he starts questioning a lot of things, and he starts to look at the original language of the scripture, and he thinks that there's a lot of changes that need to be made. Well, for this, he's put on trial and burned at the stake as a heretic. There's also, someone points out that this is not really new, that in Britain, John Wycliffe had been saying the same sort of thing. Somebody bring him in to face trial. Well, too late, he was already dead, but just for good measure, his bones were exhumed, and he was also burned at the stake post-mortem. So, and his teachings were condemned. So, in essence, this set up the terms that I don't think were used at this council. Best I can tell, these are later terms describing what happened at this council. But this set up a final sort of authoritative stamp that this council gave to a certain teaching known as Ultramontanism. Now, that has nothing to do with the Montanism from the 2nd century. That was a heresy. Ultramontanism is the right teaching of the Roman Catholic Church, based on this council and others, that says conciliarism is a heresy, or at least it's condemned, it's denounced. Conciliarism is the idea that a council has authority over the Pope. Ultramontanism, it literally means over the mountains, so over the Alps. Where does the authority of the church lie? Over the Alps in Italy, in Rome. That's where the authority of the church lies, the papacy. So Ultramontanism says the Pope has authority over a council. Conciliarism says the council has authority over a pope. And you can sort of see how the council's been backed into this corner. At Pisa and others, they tried to rein in the Pope's authority and couldn't because we've already agreed. The Pope has the final say. Who denied this? Who has already been denounced as evil, wicked heretics for thinking a council has more authority than a Pope? Well, remember, we already had that great schism in the past. That's the East-West schism. The Eastern Orthodox Christians believe exactly that. And so the Council of Constance has no choice, it seems, than to defend this ultramontanist position. So, again, I don't mean to be flippant here or to make light of this, but a lot of what we've tried to do in these series of videos is to highlight all of the wonderful things we can learn from this tradition. We've even been assigning secondary texts that have really promoted this. And some might get the idea that, see, there's something great and wonderful about the Catholic tradition. And that's because I've been trying to promote that exact sort of sentiment. But now, once you take a step back and look at all of this history in Catherine's time, well, welcome back to being a Protestant. Now, again, I don't mean to make light of things, but notice the date that we're looking at here. Just under 100 years later, Martin Luther is going to nail his 95 Theses to the door in the church in Wittenberg, and it's no surprise this causes an uproar in Germany, in not just Germany, but in all of Europe, because all of Europe was already primed and ready for a reform. It was a tinderbox that all of this had been bubbling up on the surface. It never fully went away in the next 100 years, and all Martin Luther really did was light the match. So, Catherine is writing at this incredibly important time, and the fact that her influence was already felt then tells us we should probably listen to her influence now. Well, did you get all of that? I know that was a lot of history to absorb, but again, I think it's important. Catherine played such an important role during this time, and even though the whole situation wasn't resolved in her lifetime, we see how important she was to the context and how important the context shaped her as well. For example, one of the things that she prays about in her dialogue, we get to hear her exchange with God, is what to do when there's two popes and she's not sure which one to serve. And in uncertain times, she cries out to God and asks what's right. And perhaps not all that surprisingly, God doesn't give her the answer as to which pope is right. Instead, God simply says, trust me, I'm going to sort it all out. Now, it's that sort of prayer life and that sort of ability to acknowledge what we don't know and what we sometimes can't know that I think is just a tip of the iceberg of the sort of things that Catherine can be helpful with. So in the next video, come back and we're going to look at some of her other metaphors and images and see what some of those things really have to say to us about our Christian faith.